Life Stories brings you tales of courage, resilience, and the extraordinary power of one voice. Today, we dive into the incredible journey of Olivia Carter, a high school sophomore who stood up against a system built to silence those without power. In a fight for fairness and equality, Olivia faced ridicule, relentless opposition, and overwhelming odds in the pursuit of justice for one student and millions more. Her story proves that even the smallest spark can ignite lasting change. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's inspiring journey and uncover the lessons we can all learn from Olivia's fight for what's right. The courtroom buzzed with an uneasy hum, a symphony of murmurs that ebbed and flowed like the tide. I stood at the back, observing the scene unfold, my eyes fixed on the young girl at the center of it all, Olivia Carter. She was no more than 16. A high school sophomore who had somehow landed in this monumental moment. Her hands clutched the podium tightly, knuckles white, her posture rigid but composed. The room, brimming with skepticism, turned its collective gaze to Judge Richard Manning, perched high above on the bench. Judge Manning, a man known for his sharp wit and sharper tongue, leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses with deliberate slowness. His amusement was thinly veiled, his lips curling into a smirk as he addressed Olivia. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "You, a high school sophomore, are standing in my courtroom, attempting to argue constitutional law." The spectators laughed, their ridicule rippling through the air like wildfire. But Olivia didn't flinch. Her chin was lifted, her voice steady as she replied, "Yes, Your Honor. I'm here because this case isn't just about one person's rights. It's about the rights of millions." Her words hung in the air, silencing the laughter momentarily. Judge Manning raised an eyebrow, intrigued but not yet convinced. "Millions, you say? Fascinating. And I suppose you'll be teaching me the law now, Miss Carter?" "Yes, Your Honor," Olivia replied, her voice unwavering. "I believe I just might." The courtroom erupted again, this time with a mixture of shock and amusement. I could see it then, something flickered in Manning's eyes. A momentary break in his composure. Was it doubt? Respect? Whatever it was, it disappeared as quickly as it had come. "All right, Miss Carter," he said, his tone more measured now. "Impress me." As the room quieted, I leaned against the wall, captivated by the sheer audacity of this teenager. But what struck me wasn't just her boldness, it was the fire in her eyes. A determination that spoke of something far deeper than youthful idealism. That determination hadn't come out of nowhere. Olivia Carter's story, as I later learned, began in Silverton, Ohio, a small town where life was simple, predictable, and, for the most part, unremarkable. Olivia was a bright student, top of her class, but she often felt invisible among the cliques and chaos of high school life. Her father, Daniel Carter, was her anchor, a civil rights lawyer who spent countless evenings at the dinner table recounting stories of justice and perseverance. His passion for fairness was contagious, and Olivia soaked it up like a sponge, though she never imagined it would lead her here. One evening, 6 months before the trial, Daniel came home visibly drained. Olivia was in the kitchen, setting the table for dinner when he slumped into a chair, rubbing his temples. "Rough day?" she asked, placing a plate of lasagna in front of him. "You could say that," he muttered, his voice heavy. "I'm working on a case that could set a precedent. But they want to throw it out before we even get a hearing." "What kind of case?" Olivia asked, sitting across from him. "It's about equal access to education," he explained. "A girl in Riverside County was denied admission to her local school because of a technicality. Her parents couldn't afford a lawyer. So I took it on pro bono. But the school board's lawyers are doing everything they can to bury it." Olivia frowned, the unfairness of it settling heavily on her chest. "That's awful. Can't someone do something?" Her father sighed. "I'm trying, Liv, but these things take time. resources. And honestly, I don't know if we have either. In the days that followed, Olivia watched as her father grew more exhausted. The passion in his voice dulled under the weight of the case. It pained her to see him like that. And for the first time, she felt a deep, personal desire to help. But what could she do? She was just a teenager. That question lingered until one fateful afternoon. Olivia was in her father's study, flipping through a dusty law book, when she stumbled upon an old Supreme Court case. It was about educational rights, a landmark decision that had redefined access to schools decades ago. As she read, an idea began to form, a bold, outrageous idea. When her father came home that evening, she blurted it out before fear could silence her. "Dad, what if I argued the case?" Daniel froze mid-step, his tie half undone. "What? You're always saying the law belongs to everyone," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "That it's about standing up for what's right, no matter who you are. So why can't I stand up for this girl?" For a moment, he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he shook his head. "Liv, it's not that simple. Courtrooms aren't like school debates. They'll tear you apart." "But what if they don't?" she countered. "What if I'm prepared?" Daniel sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious." That was the beginning of everything. Over the next few months, Olivia threw herself into studying the case. She read law books, debated her father at the dinner table, and practiced her arguments in front of a mirror. Her friends thought she was crazy, but Olivia didn't care. She wasn't doing this to prove anything. She was doing it because she believed in it. Because she believed in the girl who had been denied her chance at education. And now, here she was, standing in front of Judge Manning, her heart pounding but her voice unwavering. As I watched her begin her argument, I couldn't help but wonder, did she realize what she was about to step into? Did she understand the storm she was about to unleash? Or was she simply fueled by the kind of hope that only comes from truly believing in what's right? Whatever the answer, one thing was clear: Olivia Carter was not going to back down. The air in the courtroom felt charged, as though every molecule carried the weight of anticipation. Olivia Carter took a deep breath, clutching the edges of the podium. Her palms were damp, but her resolve was unwavering. Her first words cut through the silence like a sharp blade. "This case is about more than one girl being denied access to education. It's about systemic barriers that have gone unchecked for far too long." Judge Manning leaned forward slightly, his earlier smirk replaced with a look of mild curiosity. The room hung on her every word, from the reporters scribbling furiously to the skeptical faces of the defense attorneys. Olivia's voice grew steadier as she continued, weaving in precedents and personal anecdotes with a clarity that belied her age. "This isn't just about the technicalities of one school's policies," she said, her tone measured. "It's about what kind of message we send to future generations. Do we tell them that opportunity is only for the privileged? Or do we stand by the promise that education is a right for all?" The audience was transfixed. Even the judge seemed to forget for a moment that this was a teenager addressing his court. But then, as if to remind everyone of the stakes, the double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A man in a dark suit strode in, his face pale and tense. He whispered something to the court clerk, who immediately approached the bench. Judge Manning's expression darkened as he leaned in to listen. Olivia paused mid-sentence, her train of thought momentarily derailed. The room, now abuzz with murmurs, felt like a kettle on the verge of boiling over. The judge tapped his gavel, silencing the noise. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice heavier now, "please step back for a moment. It appears we have an unexpected development." Olivia's heart pounded as she moved aside, her eyes darting to her father seated in the front row. Daniel Carter gave her a small, reassuring nod, though his face betrayed the worry he tried to conceal. The judge addressed the room. The Department of Justice has informed this court of a federal investigation linked to the subject of this case. We are now adjourned until further notice. Chaos erupted. Reporters rushed to the nearest exits, eager to break the story, while the audience buzzed with speculation. Olivia stood frozen, gripping her folder so tightly her knuckles turned white. She looked to her father again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, what does this mean?" Daniel's face was grim as he placed a hand on her shoulder. "It means your case is bigger than we realized." That evening, the weight of those words settled heavily on Olivia's chest. She sat at the kitchen table, her notes spread out in front of her like a battlefield. The stakes had risen dramatically, and the realization was as thrilling as it was terrifying. Her father joined her, setting down 2 steaming mugs of cocoa. "Burning the midnight oil again?" he asked, his voice gentle but weary. "I have to," Olivia replied, her gaze fixed on a highlighted passage in a law book. "If I don't know every detail, they'll tear me apart." Daniel chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're tougher than you think. Liv, you remind me of your mom." At the mention of her mother, Olivia's heart ached. Her mother had been a fierce advocate for equality, her voice a beacon of hope in their small community. She had passed away 3 years earlier, but her lessons remained etched in Olivia's heart. "Thanks, Dad," Olivia said quietly, gripping the warm mug in her hands. "I just want to make her proud." "She already is," Daniel said, his tone firm. "And so am I." The next day, the courtroom was more crowded than ever. News of the federal investigation had drawn in reporters, activists, and curious spectators alike. The energy in the room was palpable as Judge Manning called the court back into session. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the moment, "you may continue your argument. But tread carefully. This court is no place for theatrics." "Yes, Your Honor," Olivia replied, stepping back to the podium. Her hands no longer trembled as they had before. She glanced at her father, who gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. Her voice was steady as she began again, weaving her argument with a confidence that seemed to grow with every word. But just as she began to feel the tide turning, the courtroom doors burst open once more. This time, a man in a police uniform entered, his expression grave. He approached the clerk and whispered urgently. Olivia's heart sank as she realized that once again, the story was far from over. Whatever this new development was, it was about to change everything. The courtroom, already steeped in tension, seemed to hold its collective breath as the officer handed a sealed envelope to the clerk, who promptly passed it to Judge Manning. He tore it open, his brow furrowing deeper with every word he read. Olivia stood at the podium, frozen, her mind racing through every possible scenario. What could this be? How much worse could things get? The judge looked up, his eyes sharp and his tone grave. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "this court has just received information regarding a significant development in this case. We must recess until this matter is addressed. All parties will be informed of the next steps shortly." The gavel came down with a crack, but it did little to silence the uproar that followed. Spectators whispered furiously to one another. Reporters scrambled to their phones, and the defense attorneys huddled in tense discussion. Olivia felt the weight of 100 eyes on her as she turned toward her father. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening? What does this mean?" Daniel's face was pale but composed. He placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "I don't know yet, Liv, but whatever it is, we'll face it together." The two left the courthouse amid a storm of flashing cameras and shouted questions. "Miss Carter, do you think this development will derail your case?" "Mr. Carter, is the DOJ's involvement good or bad for your argument?" The voices blurred together as Daniel guided Olivia through the throng, shielding her from the chaos as best he could. By the time they reached the car, Olivia's hands were trembling, her mind a whirl of uncertainty. Back home, The quiet was almost unnerving. Olivia sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her scattered notes. "This is too much," she muttered. Barely audible. Daniel sat across from her, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to her frayed nerves. "It's a lot. Liv, I won't lie. But you've already come this far. Don't lose sight of why you're doing this." Olivia sighed, running her hands through her hair. "It just feels like every step forward comes with 10 steps back. Like the system is designed to break people like me." "It is," Daniel admitted, his voice tinged with sadness. "But that's why people like you are so important. You're not just fighting for this case, you're fighting for everyone who's ever been silenced." The words settled heavily on Olivia's heart, but with them came a flicker of determination. "I just don't know if I can keep doing this," she admitted, her voice small. "You can," Daniel said firmly. "And you're not alone. You've got me. You've got Stephanie. And you've got a whole room full of people rooting for you. Whether you see it or not." As if summoned by his words, Stephanie Reed, their DOJ ally, called to update them. "We've uncovered something big," she said, her tone urgent. "Emails and internal communications from lobbying groups tied to the school board. They're coordinating efforts to exclude low-income students systematically. This could blow the case wide open." Olivia's grip on the phone tightened. "What do we do with it?" "We present it," Stephanie replied. "But you need to be ready. This isn't just a case anymore, Olivia. It's a battle against an entire system. And they're going to fight back harder than ever." Olivia closed her eyes, the enormity of the situation pressing down on her. But when she opened them, there was a glint of resolve. "Let's do it." The next morning, Olivia entered the courtroom with a steadiness that belied her inner turmoil. The gallery was more packed than ever, the air electric with anticipation. Judge Manning called the court to order, his tone as serious as the stakes. "Miss Reed, you may proceed with the evidence you've indicated." Stephanie rose, her movements deliberate as she handed a folder to the clerk. "Your Honor, these documents reveal a deliberate effort by certain lobbying groups to influence public education policies. They show that the denial of access in this case is part of a larger, systemic issue." The judge's face darkened as he scanned the papers. The audience's whispers grew louder, their shock palpable. But as Olivia watched the defense attorneys scramble, she realized this was only the beginning. The real fight was still ahead. And it wasn't just hers to win. It was hers to endure. For every voice that had been ignored. And for every story yet to be told. As the documents were read aloud in court, the room's atmosphere shifted. Gasps rippled through the audience. Disbelief painted across the faces of onlookers. Stephanie Reed's voice was steady as she outlined the implications of the evidence, a coordinated effort by lobbying groups and school boards to exclude low-income students from high-performing schools. This was no isolated incident, it was systemic. Olivia stood beside her father, her hands clasped tightly together. She glanced at the defense table, where Nancy Whitaker, the school board's lead attorney, was furiously whispering to her team. Olivia could see the tension etched into Whitaker's expression, the carefully controlled facade beginning to crack. But Olivia knew better than to believe this was the end of the fight. Whitaker wouldn't back down without a battle. Judge Manning cleared his throat, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs. "This evidence raises serious questions about the practices at hand," he said. "However, I caution both parties to remain focused on the specific issues of this case. This court will not tolerate theatrics." Whitaker seized the opportunity, rising to her feet with practiced composure. "Your Honor," she began, her tone clipped. "While these documents are provocative, they do not alter the fact that this case pertains to a single instance of admission denial. We maintain that this is not evidence of systemic discrimination but rather a matter of individual compliance." Olivia felt her frustration rise as she listened. How could Whitaker downplay what was so blatantly unjust? But before she could let her emotions cloud her focus, Stephanie leaned toward her, whispering, Stay calm. This is their tactic: make you angry, make you react. Don't give them that power. Taking a deep breath, Olivia steadied herself. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped to the podium, her voice firm. Your Honor, with all due respect, these documents are directly relevant. They show a pattern of exclusion that aligns with the very policies used to deny my client access to education. This isn't just about one student, it's about a system designed to shut people out. The room grew still as Olivia's words settled over the crowd. Even Judge Manning appeared momentarily caught off guard by her conviction. He nodded slightly, gesturing for her to continue. Olivia pressed on, weaving the new evidence into her argument. She spoke about the fundamental right to education, citing legal precedents and drawing comparisons to landmark cases in American history. Her voice didn't waver, her words cutting through the defense's attempts to deflect the issue. But just as the tide seemed to be turning, the courtroom doors swung open yet again. A man in a sharp navy suit entered, his expression grim. He made his way directly to Judge Manning, whispering something inaudible. The judge's face darkened as he listened, his expression growing heavier with each passing moment. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Manning announced, his tone grave. This court has received another development related to this case. We must recess immediately to address this matter. Chaos erupted for the third time that day. Reporters clamored for details, while spectators speculated wildly about the latest twist. Olivia felt the familiar weight of anxiety settle in her chest as she turned to her father. What now? She asked, her voice barely audible. Daniel's jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the room. I don't know, Liv, he admitted. But it's clear this case is bigger than we ever imagined. As they left the courthouse, Stephanie caught up with them, her expression as serious as the judge's had been moments earlier. We need to talk, she said, motioning toward a quieter corner of the building. Once they were alone, she continued, the DOJ has uncovered a communication trail, emails between several school boards and lobbying groups. They weren't just excluding students. They were actively coordinating efforts to ensure these policies remained hidden. Olivia's breath caught. They were covering it up. Not just covering it up, Stephanie said. They were protecting an entire system built to preserve privilege at the expense of everyone else. And your case might be the key to exposing it. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Olivia felt her knees weaken as she leaned against the wall for support. She had started this fight for one girl. But now it was clear she was standing at the center of a storm far larger than she'd ever anticipated. What do we do? She asked, her voice trembling but resolute. We fight, Stephanie replied without hesitation. But Liv, you need to know they'll come after you harder than ever. This isn't just a legal battle anymore. It's political. It's personal. Olivia straightened her shoulders, her resolve hardening. I'm not backing down. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady and proud. Then neither are we. As they left the courthouse, Olivia couldn't help but glance at the reporters waiting outside, their cameras ready to capture her every move. This fight was no longer just hers. It was for every student, every family, and every voice that had been silenced. And no matter how hard it got, she knew she wouldn't stop until the truth came to light. The next morning, Olivia Carter stood outside the courthouse, her breath visible in the crisp air as reporters and photographers scrambled to capture her image. She clutched her folder tightly, her heart pounding in anticipation. Today was going to be pivotal, and she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders. Daniel, her father, stood by her side, a calming presence amidst the chaos. Liv, remember, he said, his voice low but firm. You're here because you believe in what's right. Don't let them distract you from that. Olivia nodded, her jaw set. I won't. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Every seat in the gallery was filled, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. As Judge Manning entered, The room fell silent, the sound of his gavel echoing like a drumbeat. "This court will now reconvene," the judge announced. "Miss Carter, you may proceed." Olivia rose, steadying herself with a deep breath. She glanced at her father, who gave her an encouraging nod, and then at Stephanie Reed, whose confidence radiated from the prosecution's table. Stepping to the podium, Olivia began to speak. "Your Honor, this case began as a fight for one girl's right to attend her local school. But as the evidence has shown, it's about much more than that. It's about systemic exclusion. About whether we as a society value fairness and opportunity, or whether we allow privilege to dictate access to education." She paused, her words hanging in the air. The courtroom was utterly silent, every eye fixed on her. She continued, weaving in the newly uncovered emails and documents, pointing out the deliberate nature of the exclusionary policies. Olivia's voice grew stronger with each point, her confidence fueled by the reactions of the audience. Some nodded in agreement, others leaned forward, their expressions reflecting shock and outrage. At the defense table, Nancy Whitaker's face was a mask of controlled fury. She exchanged whispers with her team, occasionally shooting Olivia a sharp glare. When Olivia concluded her argument, Whitaker stood, her tone icy as she addressed the court. "Your Honor," she began, "while Miss Carter's presentation is, admittedly, compelling, it does not change the fact that this case pertains to a single student's denial of admission. Furthermore, we question the validity of the evidence presented by the DOJ. These documents were obtained through questionable means, and their relevance to this case is tenuous at best." Judge Manning raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed with her argument. "Miss Whitaker, unless you can provide substantial evidence to support your claim, the court will proceed with the assumption that the documents are valid." Whitaker hesitated, her composure slipping for the briefest moment before she nodded. "Understood, Your Honor." As the day wore on, the battle between the prosecution and defense intensified. The defense threw everything they could at Olivia, questioning her credibility, dismissing her arguments as naive, and attempting to undermine the DOJ's involvement. But Olivia held her ground, countering their points with logic, facts, and a quiet determination that was impossible to ignore. By the time the session ended, the courtroom buzzed with energy. Reporters were already drafting headlines, and spectators were murmuring about the strength of Olivia's arguments. But Olivia herself felt drained. She slumped into a chair beside her father, her hands trembling slightly as she sipped from a bottle of water. "You did great, Liv," Daniel said, his voice full of pride. "I've seen seasoned attorneys crack under the pressure you faced today. But you didn't flinch." Olivia managed a small smile. "Thanks, Dad. But I feel like this fight isn't even close to over." Daniel nodded, his expression serious. "It's not. But you've already accomplished so much. Don't lose sight of that." As they left the courthouse, Stephanie caught up with them, her face alight with a mix of exhaustion and determination. "Liv, we need to talk," she said, pulling them aside. "The DOJ has just received another tip, something that could shift the momentum even further in our favor." "What is it?" Olivia asked, her heart pounding. Stephanie hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's a recording. A whistleblower from one of the lobbying groups has come forward with audio evidence of their deliberate efforts to discredit this case and manipulate the outcome." Olivia's breath caught. "A recording? What does it say?" Stephanie's expression hardened. "It's damning. But using it will escalate this fight to an entirely new level. We'll be putting a target on your back. Liv, you need to be sure you're ready for this." Olivia swallowed hard, her mind racing. The stakes had already felt insurmountable, and now they were about to grow even higher. She looked at her father, whose steady gaze gave her strength, then back at Stephanie. "Let's do it," she said firmly. "If the truth is out there, people deserve to know." The next day, The courtroom was packed once again. The anticipation almost unbearable. Olivia's heart raced as Stephanie rose to present the recording. The battle ahead would be fierce. But Olivia knew one thing with absolute certainty: she wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. The courtroom was silent as the recording played. Every word echoed off the high walls, filling the space with the cold, calculating voice of James Collier, a key figure from one of the lobbying groups. His words were damning, dripping with the intent to discredit the DOJ and manipulate the court to preserve the status quo. "We just need to muddy the waters," his voice said. "If we create enough doubt, this case will crumble. We can't let it set a precedent, it's too risky." Gasps rippled through the room as the weight of his admission settled over the crowd. Reporters furiously scribbled notes, their pens moving like frantic insects. Olivia sat still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, but she kept her gaze fixed on the judge. Judge Manning's face was unreadable as he leaned forward, his fingers steepled. When the recording ended, Stephanie Reed stood tall, her voice steady. "Your Honor, this evidence speaks for itself." The defense's primary witness was not only biased but actively involved in an effort to undermine this case and the integrity of this courtroom. Nancy Whitaker, the school board's lead lawyer, rose swiftly, her movements sharp and deliberate. "Your Honor, this so-called evidence should not be admissible. It was obtained through questionable means, and we challenge its validity." Stephanie turned to her, her expression calm but resolute. "The recording has been authenticated by an independent source, and we are prepared to call the whistleblower as a witness if necessary." Judge Manning tapped his gavel lightly, silencing the growing murmurs in the audience. He turned to Whitaker. "Miss Whitaker, unless you have concrete evidence to refute the authenticity of this recording, the court will admit it into the record." Whitaker hesitated, her composure visibly faltering. "Understood. Your Honor," she said through clenched teeth, returning to her seat. The room buzzed with whispers and speculation as Judge Manning addressed the court. "This is serious evidence, and it warrants thorough consideration. The implications are profound, but I will remind all parties to remain focused on the matter at hand." Olivia watched as Collier, seated at the defense table, visibly squirmed under the weight of the recording. His confidence was shattered, his smirk replaced with a pale, hollow expression. For the first time, Olivia felt the scales tip in her favor, a glimmer of justice breaking through the clouds. But the battle wasn't over. Whitaker stood again, her voice icy and sharp. "Your Honor, while the plaintiff's case may be compelling, we maintain that this court must consider whether Miss Carter, a high school student with no formal legal training, is even qualified to present these arguments. We renew our motion to dismiss on those grounds." A fresh wave of murmurs spread through the room, and Olivia's stomach twisted. She knew this attack wasn't about her competence, it was about shaking her confidence and shifting the narrative. Stephanie rose to her defense. "Your Honor, there is precedent for individuals, particularly minors, presenting arguments in cases where they have a direct stake. Miss Carter has demonstrated extraordinary preparedness and understanding of the issues. Her age does not diminish the validity of her argument." Judge Manning considered the arguments, his expression grave. After a long pause, he spoke. "This court recognizes the unique nature of this case. Miss Carter's argument is not only relevant but critical. The motion to dismiss is denied." The tension broke as murmurs of approval swept through the gallery. Olivia exhaled deeply, relief washing over her as Stephanie gave her an encouraging nod. But she knew this was far from the end. That evening, Olivia and her father returned home, exhausted but hopeful. Daniel placed a mug of tea in front of her as they sat at the kitchen table. "Liv, I know today was tough, but you handled yourself better than most seasoned lawyers would." Olivia smiled faintly. "Thanks, Dad. But every time I feel like we're making progress, they come back swinging harder." That's because they're scared. Daniel said firmly. They see what you're doing. Liv, you're not just fighting for one girl, you're threatening a system that's built on keeping people like her out. The words resonated deeply with Olivia, igniting a spark of determination. Then let them be scared, she said quietly but firmly. I'm not stopping. The next morning, the courtroom was once again packed. This time, the air was different, charged with anticipation and a growing sense of hope. As Olivia took her seat, she felt the weight of the fight ahead. But she also felt the support of those around her. The truth was on her side, and she was ready to face whatever came next. This was no longer just a case. It was a movement. And Olivia Carter was at its heart. As the final gavel echoed through the courtroom, Olivia Carter stood victorious, her heart pounding with a mix of pride and relief. The judge's ruling not only granted justice to the girl at the center of the case but also set a powerful precedent for students across the state. Olivia had faced ridicule, resistance, and relentless opposition. But her unwavering determination had turned the tide. Outside the courthouse, a sea of supporters cheered, their voices blending into a triumphant roar. Olivia stood before the cameras, her voice steady as she said, "This isn't just my victory. It belongs to every student, every family, and every person who believes in fairness and equality. The fight isn't over. But today, we've taken a step forward." Her story reminds us that one voice can spark a movement. Subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales of courage and determination.